The dust of Mesopotamia shimmered under the autumn sun, heat rising in wavering lines across the plain. It was the 2nd of October, 331 years before Christ, and the world itself seemed to hold its breath. A young king from the small and fractious lands of Greece had led his men far from their homeland, across seas and mountains into the very heart of the Persian Empire, the greatest power the world had ever known. He was 25 years old, and his name was Alexander. The fate of nations, the legacy of empires, and perhaps the direction of history itself now gathered at a single field north of the Tigris River, a place that would be remembered forever as Gaugamela. But before the armies clashed, before the ground shook beneath the hooves of thousands of horses, there was silence, a silence filled with dread, anticipation, and the heavy weight of destiny. Who could imagine that fewer than 50,000 Greeks, hardened veterans of years of relentless campaigning, would dare to face nearly twice their number in the army of Darius III, the King of Kings? Who could believe that in this moment, surrounded and outnumbered, Alexander of Macedon would not simply survive, but forever shatter the myth of Persian invincibility? Yet to understand this clash, one must first step back and see the forces that drew these two titans together. Persia, an empire stretching from the Aegean to the Indus, was built on vast wealth, chariots, cavalry, and the loyalty, or at least submission, of countless subject peoples. Its kings had ruled for centuries, masters of Asia, feared by their enemies, respected even by those who resisted them. But empires, like men, grow old. Corruption, revolt, and complacency gnawed at the empire's edges. And across the narrow sea in Greece, something new had arisen. A warrior culture honed in endless wars between city-states, then unified under Philip II of Macedon, a ruthless strategist who forged the most disciplined fighting force of its age. His son Alexander inherited not only that army, but his father's vision of conquest. From the moment he crossed into Asia, Alexander seemed more than mortal to his men. He moved with relentless purpose, striking like a thunderbolt at the Persian satrapies, crushing resistance and offering clemency to those who yielded. At the Granicus River, his cavalry had carved through the Persian satrapal forces. At Issus, against Darius himself, Alexander had already shown his genius, breaking through despite being heavily outnumbered. Yet Darius survived that defeat, fled eastward, and rallied his forces once more. Now in this moment at Gaugamela, he had gathered an army of immense scale, cavalry from Bactria, infantry from Babylon, scythed chariots from the plains, and contingents drawn from every corner of his realm. His numbers dwarfed Alexander's. His chariots were designed to slice through Greek lines like scythes through wheat. He had elephants brought to terrify men unused to their sight. Darius believed the gods had granted him one final chance to end this Macedonian incursion and preserve the throne of Persia. Alexander, for his part, did not flinch. He had studied every movement of his opponent, anticipated the ground upon which he would fight, and prepared his men for what lay ahead. Where Darius brought multitudes, Alexander brought precision. The Macedonian phalanx, with their sarissas, long spears forming a wall of death, stood as the immovable core of his army. Around them, his companion cavalry, elite horsemen, sworn to follow him into the jaws of death, waited for the signal that would unleash them. Discipline, cohesion, and a bond of loyalty stronger than fear held his army together. Yet beyond tactics and numbers, there was something more. For Alexander, this was not merely a battle, it was destiny. He believed himself chosen, touched by the divine, a son of Zeus Ammon. Whether or not his men believed it too, they saw in him a commander who never asked them to go where he himself would not lead. They saw a man who shared their hardships, marched beside them, and risked his life at the front. To his enemies he was reckless. To his followers he was invincible. On the eve of battle, the contrast between the two camps could not have been starker. Darius's forces spread across the horizon, their campfires stretching like stars across the plain, a dazzling sea of flame that seemed to encircle the smaller Macedonian host. Persian charioteers oiled their wheels, sharpening the blades that jutted from their axles. Cavalry officers issued orders, banners of every color flapping in the evening breeze. Elephants rumbled, unsettling horses tethered nearby. In Alexander's camp, the mood was quieter, steadier. His men polished their armor, checked their weapons, and ate their rations in silence. They had seen this before, they had faced overwhelming odds before. What mattered was not the numbers, but the man who led them. And as Alexander walked among them, speaking to officers and soldiers alike, confidence spread like wildfire. He assured them that the gods were with them, that courage and discipline would prevail, and that by the next day the riches of Asia would be theirs. He spoke not only as a general but as a comrade. He did not promise them ease, but he promised them glory. When dawn broke, the sky burned with the first light of battle. The field at Gaugamela stretched wide, flat, chosen deliberately by Darius to maximize the effectiveness of his chariots. Alexander had surveyed it and knew the risks, but he trusted his men and his plan. As the armies deployed, the scale of what was about to occur became clear. Tens of thousands of Persians formed a line so vast it threatened to envelop the Macedonian force entirely. Banners rippled, drums thundered, and the ground shook beneath the weight of horses. Across from them, Alexander's smaller army tightened its ranks, forming into a compact and unyielding block, spears bristling, cavalry poised. The question now hung in the air, as sharp as any blade. Could discipline defeat chaos? Could precision overcome sheer weight of numbers? Could one man's vision outmatch the resources of an empire? The answer would come not from words, but from the clash of bronze and iron, from the cries of men, from the thunder of hooves. At Gaugamela, history itself would be decided. The first moments of battle were like the drawing of a great breath. Both armies faced one another across the plain, lines stretching farther than the eye could see. Darius, from his lofty chariot surrounded by Persian nobles, surveyed the field with grim determination. His army was vast, its wings outflanking the Macedonian position on either side. This was the battlefield he had chosen, flattened and cleared in advance, so that his chariots could sweep across it unhindered. He believed Alexander would have no room to maneuver, that he would be pressed from all directions and drowned beneath the weight of Persian numbers. Yet Alexander did not deploy in the rigid square his enemies expected. His eye scanned the terrain, the subtle slopes, the uneven patches of ground invisible to most but to him as clear as lines drawn on parchment. He arranged his army in a way both daring and unconventional. Instead of anchoring himself directly against the Persian center, he angled his right wing forward, extending it slightly, almost as if he were exposing his flank. It was a feint, but one that would draw the Persians into committing prematurely, pulling their strongest cavalry units away from the heart of the battlefield. The Macedonian phalanx stood in the middle, a forest of sarissas gleaming in the sun, their shields locked, their discipline unshakable. Behind them, Alexander placed reserves, infantry and cavalry carefully held back, ready to plug gaps or strike when the moment came. On his left wing, under the command of Parmenion, the Macedonian cavalry braced for the inevitable storm. They were fewer in number than the Persian horsemen who faced them, yet they knew their task was not to break the enemy, but to endure to hold the line at all costs until the decisive blow was struck elsewhere. As the Persian drums began to pound, the air filled with the roar of thousands of men and the clatter of hooves. The first wave advanced, the scythed chariots, their polished blades gleaming like the talons of some monstrous bird. Designed to terrify, these vehicles would thunder into the phalanx, slicing apart men and spears alike, leaving gaps through which cavalry could flood. Darius's ancestors had used them to devastating effect, and he hoped they would shatter Alexander's center before the battle had truly begun. The ground trembled as the chariots rushed forward. Horses strained, drivers lashed whips, and the great wheels cut grooves into the soil. To any untested army, it would have been a sight of horror, a storm of iron and speed bearing down with murderous intent. But Alexander had anticipated this very moment. He had drilled his men relentlessly, teaching them not to fear the charge, but to face it with calm precision. As the chariots neared, the Macedonian phalanx opened, not with panic but with discipline. Ranks parted, creating lanes through which the chariots barreled harmlessly. Javelin throwers stationed within the gaps hurled their missiles at the onrushing horses, skewering them, toppling drivers and sending vehicles crashing in chaos. Others were dragged down by the sheer density of spears, horses impaled before they could break the lines. The thunder of the chariots dissolved into a cacophony of screams, shattered wood, and dying animals. When the dust cleared, the great weapon of Persia lay ruined at the feet of the Greek infantry. The Macedonians closed their ranks once more, unbroken, unyielding, and ready. Darius, watching from his chariot, felt the first chill of doubt. His carefully prepared opening blow had failed, and the Macedonians had not only endured but destroyed his vaunted scythed terror. Yet he still had the advantage of numbers. His cavalry surged forward, immense wings of horsemen sweeping across the plain, aiming to envelop Alexander's smaller army. The left wing of the Macedonian line groaned under the pressure, as Parmenion and his horsemen fought desperately to hold against overwhelming odds. Persian cavalry, superior in number and speed, pushed again and again, threatening to break through. On the opposite wing, Alexander led the companion cavalry in person. Dressed in gleaming armor, his helmet catching the sun, he was more than a king. He was the visible soul of the army. He urged his men forward, not recklessly but with careful timing. Rather than charge directly into the mass of Persian cavalry, he angled his wing outward, pulling his troops toward the right. It was a maneuver that seemed dangerous, even suicidal, for it created a gap between his phalanx and his cavalry. To Darius, it appeared as though the Macedonian formation was beginning to unravel. The temptation was irresistible. He sent his cavalry surging into the gap, convinced he had found the flaw that would destroy Alexander. But what seemed like weakness was in truth a trap. Alexander had drawn the Persian cavalry out, stretching their line and opening the center of their formation. His angled advance had not been a mistake, but the prelude to a decisive strike. At the perfect moment, when the Persians were overextended and the gap before him widened, Alexander wheeled his companions inward, forming a wedge that drove straight into the exposed heart of the Persian line. The charge was like a thunderbolt. The Macedonian cavalry, armored and disciplined, crashed into the Persians with unstoppable force. At their head, Alexander fought as any common soldier, spear in hand, striking down foes, his presence igniting the fury of his men. The wedge cut through the enemy ranks like a blade through cloth, tearing open the very center where Darius himself stood in his chariot. The battlefield, until then a contest of maneuver and endurance, erupted into chaos. Persian nobles rushed to defend their king, but the sudden breach sent shockwaves of panic through the army. The King of Kings, who had hoped to watch Alexander's destruction from a position of safety, now found himself staring directly into the storm. For a moment, all hung in balance. The fate of the empire, the destiny of the young conqueror, and the outcome of the greatest clash of East and West in antiquity came down to a single point on the field, and in that point stood Alexander, spear raised, eyes fixed on Darius. The gods themselves seemed to lean forward, watching what would unfold next. The moment of collision at the center of the battlefield seemed like the clash of two worlds. The Persian King of Kings, adorned in royal robes, his chariot shimmering with gold and inlays of precious stone, stood as the living embodiment of empire. Before him surged Alexander, bronze flashing, his horse Bucephalus driving into the press of men, his companions forming an unstoppable wedge around him. The Macedonian charge was not merely a military maneuver. It was a spear thrust aimed at the very heart of Persia itself. The Persian nobles fought with desperate courage. They wheeled their horses, thrust their spears, and raised their shields in defense of their king. But the momentum was against them. Alexander's cavalry, drilled to perfection, punched deeper into the Persian center, scattering guards and shattering the order of the enemy line. Arrows fell in clouds, dust rose in choking swirls, and the clash of iron against bronze echoed like thunder across the plain. In the turmoil, Darius looked upon the advancing storm and felt the ground tremble beneath him. The chariot that had carried him in majesty now became a trap. His horses panicked at the noise, threatening to rear and overturn. Around him, loyal men fell one after another, their blood staining the wheels that had once carried Achaemenid kings in triumphal processions. The mighty King of Kings, who had dreamed of crushing this upstart Macedonian, now faced the terror of annihilation. Historians have debated the moment of his flight. Some say he turned too soon, abandoning an army that still fought bravely. Others argue that no mortal could have stood firm when Alexander himself bore down upon them, a living tempest of steel and fury. Whatever the truth, The image that endured was unmistakable. Darius turning his chariot away from the fray, fleeing across the plain, his royal standard vanishing in the dust. That sight broke the spell. The Persian army, vast though it was, drew its courage from the presence of its king. When he disappeared, doubt spread like fire in dry grass. Units faltered, then wavered, and then collapsed altogether. Cavalry, who had pressed so furiously against Parmenions' left, now lost their will to fight. Infantry in the center, already battered by the phalanx, began to retreat. The elephants, bewildered, trumpeted and wheeled out of control. What had moments before been a disciplined, terrifying host became a tide of panic, rippling outward from the absence of its leader. But the battle was not yet secure. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion and his men still fought for their lives. The Persian cavalry there, unaware that their king had fled, pressed hard against the thinner Macedonian line. If they broke through, they could strike at the Macedonian camp, cut supply lines, or even fall upon the rear of Alexander's center. In the maelstrom of battle, communication was slow, and Parmenion sent desperate messages for aid. Alexander faced a decision that has haunted historians ever since. Should he pursue Darius at once, striking him down and ending the war in a single stroke? Or should he turn aside to rescue his hard-pressed left wing, ensuring the survival of his army? The choice was fateful. Some of his men urged him forward. "The king is yours. End it now." But Alexander, for all his ambition, was no fool. He knew that if his army collapsed behind him, victory would turn to ash. Reluctantly, he turned his companions toward the left, tearing himself away from the vision of a fleeing Darius. The charge of the companion cavalry against the Persian horsemen at the left was ferocious. Macedonian lances struck true, cutting down enemy riders, scattering their formations, and finally relieving the pressure on Parmenion's exhausted men. With the support of Alexander himself, the left wing rallied and held. The Persians, seeing the center broken and their cavalry now outflanked, gave way in a cascading rout. What had been a battle became a slaughter. The plain of Gaugamela filled with chaos. Persian soldiers fled in every direction, pursued by the relentless Macedonians. Cavalry cut down stragglers. Infantry pressed forward over the bodies of the fallen. Dust and blood mingled in the choking air. Thousands fell where they stood, while others threw down their arms and begged for mercy. Yet Alexander, though merciless in victory, was focused still on the larger goal. He had not captured Darius. The King of Kings had escaped once more, vanishing eastward with what remained of his guard, and so the field of Gaugamela became both a triumph and a frustration. Triumph, because the Persian army had been utterly defeated, its might shattered, its morale destroyed. Frustration, because the quarry that Alexander most desired had slipped through his grasp. Still, the outcome was decisive. With the Persian army routed and the royal standard abandoned, the empire lay open before him. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the great capitals of Asia, would soon fall into his hands. As the sun dipped low over the horizon, the Macedonian soldiers gathered among the spoils. They looked upon the carnage of 100,000 defeated enemies and marveled that their smaller force had endured. They spoke of their king with awe, for they had seen him lead from the front, risking his life again and again, as though the gods themselves had shielded him from harm. To them, the battle was proof that Alexander was no ordinary man. To the world beyond, it was a moment when the balance of power shifted irreversibly. The Persian Empire, which for 2 centuries had stood as the colossus of the East, now staggered, mortally wounded. The Greeks, once fragmented city-states vulnerable to Persian invasion, had through Macedon's spear turned into conquerors of Asia. Yet even in victory, the story was not over. Darius lived, and as long as he lived, the war was not finished. Alexander knew this, and he would not rest until the King of Kings was brought to heel. Still, in the memory of men, the Battle of Gaugamela burned as something greater than mere strategy. It was not just an army defeating another, but the triumph of discipline over chaos, of vision over tradition, of destiny over hesitation. It was the moment when a young king from a small corner of the world stood against the might of an empire and did not falter. And in that moment, history itself seemed to tilt on its axis, opening a path to the creation of an empire that would stretch farther than Persia had ever dreamed. As night fell on the plain, the stars glimmered cold and distant. The battlefield lay silent save for the groans of the wounded and the crackle of campfires. Amid the wreckage of broken chariots and fallen banners, Alexander stood with his generals, gazing eastward. His eyes were not on the dead, nor even on the victory they had secured. They were fixed on the horizon, where Darius had fled. For Alexander, Gaugamela was not the end. It was the gateway to something far greater. When dawn rose on the day after Gaugamela, the plain still bore the scars of conquest. Broken spears jutted from the earth, horses lay lifeless where they had fallen, and the moans of the wounded mingled with the cries of carrion birds. The scale of the victory became clear as the Macedonians counted the enemy dead. Tens of thousands lay scattered across the field, while their own losses numbered in the hundreds. Against overwhelming odds, Alexander had not merely won. He had annihilated the last great army Persia could raise. Yet the battle was only the beginning of transformation. For years, Alexander had been fighting as a Macedonian king, leading Greeks and allies against the empire that had once invaded their homeland. But now, with Darius in flight and the imperial capitals exposed, Alexander stood not as a mere invader, but as a claimant to the throne of Asia. The line between conqueror and king blurred, and the destiny he sought began to take shape. The march southward after Gaugamela was unlike any other. Instead of resistance, Alexander encountered submission. Babylon, the ancient city of wonders, the heart of Mesopotamia, opened its gates to him. The priests, the nobles, the artisans, those who had once sworn allegiance to Darius, welcomed the young Macedonian as a liberator. They crowned him with flowers, led him in procession to the great temple of Marduk, and placed the symbols of kingship in his hands. In their eyes, he was not a foreign conqueror, but a rightful king sent by the gods to restore order. The soldiers marveled at the wealth that poured into their grasp. Gold and silver piled high, treasures from centuries of conquest, now redistributed among men who only months before had slept on rough ground. Alexander himself refrained from plunder. Instead, he moved carefully, presenting himself not as a destroyer, but as heir to the empire he had defeated. He honored the Babylonian gods, made sacrifices in their temples, and restored privileges to the priesthood. By doing so, he won not only the city, but its soul. From Babylon he moved to Susa, another capital laden with unimaginable wealth. Here too the gates opened without resistance. Alexander took possession of the royal treasury, vast beyond reckoning, enough to fund his campaigns for years to come. But again he acted not as a looter but as a ruler. He appointed satraps, restored local officials, and began the delicate work of governing. For Alexander understood that conquest was only the first step. To hold Asia, he had to be more than Macedonian. He had to become Persian in the eyes of Persians. Yet the shadow of Darius still lingered. The great king had fled eastward, still alive, still claiming legitimacy. As long as he lived, Alexander could not fully claim the title of King of Kings. The pursuit resumed, relentless and determined, across plains and mountains, deeper into the empire's heartlands. Each step carried Alexander farther from Greece and Macedon, farther from the familiar, and deeper into a world where east and west blurred. It was here, in the aftermath of Gaugamela, that the character of Alexander began to change. Once he had been the champion of Greece against Persia. Now he began to dress in Persian robes, to sit upon the throne of the Achaemenids, to adopt the trappings of the very monarchy he had sought to overthrow. To his Macedonian companions, hardened men of the phalanx who had followed him since youth, this shift was troubling. They whispered that their king no longer seemed wholly theirs. Yet Alexander pressed forward, convinced that to rule an empire, he must be seen not as an outsider, but as the rightful heir. The symbolic weight of Gaugamela became clear as he entered Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, city of kings, jewel of the empire. Here stood the great palaces built by Darius the Third and Xerxes, adorned with reliefs of subject nations bearing tribute, halls designed to proclaim the supremacy of the Persian monarch. To walk through its gates was to step into the very heart of imperial majesty. Alexander's soldiers, drunk on victory and treasure, clamored for revenge, for the burning of temples in Greece, for the suffering their ancestors had endured during Xerxes' invasion. And so, in an act both symbolic and controversial, Persepolis was set aflame. The great halls of the Achaemenid kings, carved with the pride of centuries, burned in a night of roaring fire. Some say Alexander did it in drunken revelry, egged on by courtesans who whispered of vengeance. Others claim it was deliberate, a statement that Persia's empire was finished, its legacy reduced to ashes. The flames consumed marble and cedar, casting sparks into the dark sky, a funeral pyre for the fallen dynasty. Yet even as he destroyed, Alexander preserved. He retained Persian officials, learned from their customs, and increasingly saw himself not as a foreign ruler, but as master of a new blended world. The Battle of Gaugamela had given him the power to choose. He could remain a Macedonian conqueror, raiding and plundering, or he could step into the role of universal king, bridging cultures, uniting East and West under one crown. He chose the latter, though not without cost. For his men, the veterans who had marched with him since Macedonia, the transformation was unsettling. They had fought to humble Persia, not to become Persians themselves. They expected reward, not ceremonies in foreign temples or a king who demanded obeisance like an oriental monarch. The seeds of future discord were sown in this period, even as the triumphs multiplied. Gaugamela had given Alexander an empire, but it also thrust upon him the burden of reconciling two worlds. Still, the victory remained unmatched. In the annals of history, generals had won battles, kings had conquered lands, but few had overturned the balance of civilizations in a single clash. At Gaugamela, Alexander had not only broken an army, he had shattered an idea, the idea that Persia was eternal, that no power could challenge its throne. In its place rose a new vision, a Macedonian youth, son of a murdered king, pupil of Aristotle, believing himself chosen by the gods to rule all mankind. In the silence after the fires of Persepolis, one could almost hear the echo of destiny. The men who had stood on the plain of Gaugamela, who had braced against scythed chariots and followed their king into the storm, now found themselves at the center of a world transformed. Behind them lay victory, before them uncharted lands, new enemies, and the insatiable ambition of a leader who could not stop. For Alexander was not content with what he had won. Persia had fallen, but beyond Persia lay India, and beyond India perhaps worlds yet unknown. Gaugamela was the climax of one war, but it was only the prelude to another. The young king, whose army had triumphed against impossible odds, now carried his gaze farther than any had dared before. The plain of Gaugamela receded into memory, but its shadow stretched long across the ancient world. It was the moment when East yielded to West, when the greatest empire of its age fell to the will of one man, and it was the moment when that man, Alexander, stepped across the threshold of history into legend. Long after the dust of battle had settled and the blood had dried on the plain, the memory of Gaugamela lived on. Ancient chroniclers, poets, and storytellers returned to it again and again, for it was not simply a battle, it was a turning point in the history of civilizations. In its outcome, one world ended and another began. Persia, which for generations had towered as the great empire of the East, fell into ruin. Macedonia, a kingdom that only decades before had been dismissed as a backwater on the edges of Greece, now stood astride the world. And at the center of it all was one man, Alexander. The scale of what he had achieved was staggering. At the head of an army scarcely numbering 47,000, he had marched thousands of miles from home, faced an empire with resources beyond measure, and struck it down in the field. His men had trusted him, followed him, endured hunger, thirst, and exhaustion, and on the day of trial their discipline had proven stronger than the weight of numbers. Against them had stood more than 100,000 Persians, drawn from the farthest reaches of Asia. The difference in size should have been decisive, yet at Gaugamela it was not numbers that mattered, but vision, cohesion, and the will of one commander. The Persian defeat was not merely military, it was psychological, almost spiritual. For centuries, the kings of Persia had been regarded as semi-divine figures, protectors of order against chaos, lords of the four corners of the earth. Their armies had been thought inexhaustible, their wealth unassailable. To see such a king, Darius III, flee before the charge of Alexander shattered that illusion. No longer did Persia seem eternal. No longer did the East appear invincible. The world had seen that even the mightiest empire could fall. For Alexander, the victory confirmed what he already believed, that he was chosen by fate to rule not only Macedonia, not only Greece, but the entire world. In his mind, Gaugamela was not just a triumph of strategy, it was proof of divine favor. He began to speak of himself as the son of Zeus Ammon, protector of all mankind. His men, though less certain of his divinity, could not deny that wherever he led, victory followed. The consequences rippled far beyond the battlefield. With Persia's defeat, the centers of wealth and power shifted. Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, all fell into Alexander's hands, their treasures fueling further campaigns. The Persian administration, once the model of imperial governance, was now bent to serve a new master. And with Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and titles, a new hybrid world began to emerge, a fusion of Greek and Eastern traditions that would shape centuries to come. Yet Gaugamela also cast a long shadow over Alexander's men. They had fought for glory and plunder, but the more their king embraced Persian ways, the more alien he seemed. Some whispered that the fire of Persepolis had been a cleansing act, a symbolic destruction of the old order, but others saw it as a reckless excess. The bond between king and army, forged in blood and trust, would endure, but the seeds of division had been planted. The fate of Darius became a tragic coda to the story. Hunted relentlessly, betrayed by his own satraps, he was murdered in the east, abandoned by those who once called him master. When Alexander found his body, he covered it with a royal cloak and gave him a king's burial. It was both a gesture of respect and a declaration. The line of the Achaemenids had ended, and with it, Persia as the world had known it. Alexander was now the heir, not merely the conqueror. Historians have long debated what Gaugamela truly meant. Was it the ultimate triumph of Hellenic freedom over Asiatic despotism, as some later writers claimed? Or was it the beginning of a new kind of empire, in which Greek and Persian would blend, creating something greater than either had alone? The answer, perhaps, lies in the legacy Alexander left behind. His empire did not long survive his death, but the cultural currents he set in motion, Hellenism spreading across Asia, cities founded from Egypt to India, Greek thought mingling with Eastern traditions, endured for centuries, and so the battle lived on not only in chronicles but in imagination. To the Greeks it was proof that courage and discipline could overcome overwhelming odds. To later rulers, it was a model of decisive leadership, of how one man's daring could reshape the fate of nations. To poets and philosophers, it was a moment when human ambition seemed to brush against the divine. Stand upon the plain of Gaugamela today, and the winds still whisper of that clash. The earth remembers where chariots thundered, where spears broke, where the King of Kings fled and the conqueror pressed on. It is barren now, silent save for the rustle of grass, but in that silence echoes the roar of armies, the cries of men, the thundering hooves of horses, and the vision of a young king who would not be stopped. For in the end, Gaugamela was not only about the defeat of Persia, it was about the rise of Alexander, about the forging of a legend that has never faded. When people speak of generals, of battles, of moments when history turned, Gaugamela stands among the greatest. It was where the West, embodied in one man, stood against the East, embodied in an empire and emerged victorious. And though Alexander would march farther, fight greater foes and dream larger dreams, it was here, on this field in 331 BC, that he secured his place in the eternal story of mankind. The dust may have settled, the empires may have passed, but the tale of how 47,000 Greeks defeated 100,000 Persians at Gaugamela will echo as long as men remember what it means to stand against impossible odds and prevail.